I just completed my master's degree at the University of York, and I will just be giving a quick summary of what I did. So to begin, I'll start with an introduction discussing archaeological games and collaborative games, and then I'll move on to my research questions for the project, as well as my methodology, and then I'll finally share my results and wrap up with my conclusions and possibilities for future research. All right, so a brief overview of the field of archaeogaming. Archaeologists have recognized the value that video games can bring to both creating and disseminating archaeological knowledge, and the efforts to make the most out of this interactive medium have been ongoing for over 20 years now. Video games require their audience to be active rather than passive learners, and in order to progress through a game, players must both understand and be able to implement their knowledge. This is something not afforded by traditional media, and professional archaeologists have been particularly interested to take advantage of this multilinear medium that allows for the co-creation of emergent narratives. Archaeogaming is a term coined by Andrew Reinhard and has now expanded into a respected study in the academic community, and several frameworks for developing archaeology and heritage games have been created by Helena Granstrom in 2013 and then Ashlyn Pym in 2019. So archaeological games from both academic and commercial sectors are now available and have provided players the opportunity to learn more about archaeological and heritage themes. All right, so as part of my dissertation, I defined archaeological games as those that compel players to ask and answer questions about the presented past in the context of the main narrative of the game. I wouldn't consider games like Assassin's Creed to be archaeological, however, because although they require an amazing amount of archaeological reconstruction and archaeological interpretation to build, they require absolutely no archaeological interpretation to play. Games like Heaven's Vault and Outer Wilds, however, are a great example of archaeological games because they force players to confront uncertainty by introducing gaps in knowledge and encouraging players to fill in those gaps in order to reach the end of the game. In other words, they require players to approach the problems a way an archaeologist would. Although I've noticed that, with one exception, all current archaeological games are decidedly single player. This seems strange to me because I think, as many of you might agree, archaeology is not necessarily a one-person endeavor. The field relies on a host of experts and unique perspectives in order to solve the mysteries of the past. So I did some research into collaborative games for my dissertation. Collaborative games are multiplayer games that require the players to work together to achieve shared rather than individual goals. Many collaborative games are set in escape room type scenarios, with very popular example being Portal 2. In other collaborative games like The Past Within, players have completely different environments and are looking at different types of information. So in those scenarios, the success of the game is reliant upon the player's ability to communicate. So before this dissertation, the only multiplayer archaeological game in existence was the Janus Project by Loiseau et al. In 2013. The Janus Project was a mixed reality game that grouped players around Lyon, France, together to learn more about the city's archaeology and create an information board about the archaeology of the city, which is also known as the jigsaw pedagogy method. So each player is assigned to learn about a different aspect of the archaeology so that when they create their information board, no one person has more knowledge or more of a say over the resulting information board than anybody else. So for my research questions, the main question that I wanted to answer was, can collaborative multiplayer environments effectively challenge and facilitate learning about the nature of archaeological knowledge production through deep discussion and reflection? My secondary questions included, does the interaction between players affect the interpretations they make about the content presented? How can games communicate and instill uncertainty in players? And then how do the research tendencies of non-archaeologists differ from archaeologists? To answer these questions, I decided to make and test a prototype of collaborative archaeological game. So I first did an ethnographic observation of an archaeological site to ground my prototype in reality and inform my game mechanics. Then I designed and built the game before reaching out to archaeologists and non-archaeologists to play the game and take a survey about it. And then finally, I compared the gameplays to the survey results and to my ethnography. All right, so I joined the University of York archaeology undergraduates at Skipsea Castle in East Yorkshire, and I took notes and videos while they excavated the remains of an Iron Age structure. I was mainly looking for what kinds of conversations were going on in the field and how those conversations influenced the way that they conducted the excavation. The main theme of the comments made by the students was confusion and hesitancy. And many of the students had overcut their post holes that they were excavating, and they were nervous to make the same mistakes again. Almost all of the students needed help or clarification from each other and the supervisors to make sense of the artifacts, ecofacts, and features that they were uncovering. And then the supervisors themselves, they often thought out loud with each other to generate ideas and negotiate the significance of what they were looking at on site. Their discussions solidified their understanding of the site and how the excavation should proceed. So from those observations, I decided that the most authentic feeling or aesthetic, as we say in game studies, from archaeology that we could reproduce in a game would be uncertainty. All right, so I used the mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics framework to design my game. This is a well-known ontology within game studies that focuses on creating mechanics or operations that allow for the gameplay to progress with an intention to elicit certain emotions within players. For instance, the digging mechanic that I used was meant to create feelings of discovery and destruction, while the note-taking and identification was meant to encourage uncertainty and fellowship. I drew from several different games for inspiration, with perhaps the most notable one being the note-taking mechanic, which I took from a detective game called Tangle Tower. Basically, you choose from a list, several different lists of options to form a statement that you believe to be true to make the deductions in that game for your case, but in my game for your archaeological interpretations. Okay, so I built the entirety of the game in an engine called GDevelop, which is an open source 2D game engine, and it doesn't require the user to write a single line of code. Instead, you input your programming logic into GDevelop, and then it will translate that into code for you. That was really helpful for me because it meant that I didn't have to worry about implementing complex functions or have to worry about syntax errors. But the downside of this, however, was that I have absolutely no idea what the underlying code looks like and what implicit biases may be included by the creators of the engine. Furthermore, like every game engine, GDevelop provides default workflows and design standards, and these cater more towards platformer and adventure games than any other genre. So to create my game, I had to use a lot of creative thinking in order to create mechanics that do not fit into that traditional convention of a platformer or an adventure game. I also had to create a lot of my own art for the game. In this era of platformization, artists are more incentivized to make game assets that will appeal to as broad a base of developers as possible. So, needless to say, finding any art, let alone free art, of lithic debitage was almost entirely impossible. I used what little royalty-free art I could find and ended up using Photopea to create art based off of the artifacts found at the Mesolithic site of Starcar in North Yorkshire. And that was also the inspiration for the fictional site that I used in the prototype of the game. This was a very time-consuming process, and as a consequence, I ended up not having enough time to implement sound and music into the game, which I had originally intended to do, but ran out of time, as happens to many master's projects. All right, so to give you a brief description of the game, the players first choose a role. One of them chooses to play as a lithic specialist, while the other plays as a zoo archaeologist. The only difference between the two roles is that they have different resources to draw from when they interpret the artifacts. And that's how I incorporated a jigsaw pedagogy into my game. And so the two are meant to use their combined knowledge from their resources to be able to interpret the artifacts and the site as a whole. They are also each placed in half of the same trench, so they also have to work across their trench, their halves of trench to understand the broader site. The players are given 10 minutes to excavate and record as much as possible before they run out of funding. You can see the timer at the top, and you can see the note-taking mechanic just at the bottom there. Each of the statements are documented in the notebooks that you can see under the little image of the trowel, and they have access to that throughout the entire gameplay. And so when their funding runs out, they have to write a press release describing their interpretations of the site. And the press release consists of 5 very, very broad questions that ask the players to explain what they think happened at the site based on their findings. For each question, they have 2 choices. They can either choose to write in an answer, or they can say, "We don't know." I didn't include more options because I didn't want to unconsciously lead the players to any particular response. I wanted them to discuss what they had seen with each other and then decide together what the best interpretation could be. If the players write in more responses, then select the "we don't know" option, then they are able to secure funding for another season, thereby winning the game. All right, so I had 9 groups of 2 people play the prototype. I first had them answer one half of a survey before they played the game. And the first half of the survey covered their experiences in the past with archaeology, heritage, and video games. And then they played the game, and after playing the game, they completed the second half of the survey, which covered their experience and opinions of the game, as well as their perceptions of archaeology and if those had changed after playing the game. I also recorded and later transcribed the gameplays using the same Let's Play format that Glass et al. Used for preserving gameplay experiences at the Netherlands Institute of Sound and Vision, as seen as the picture just on the side there. So I used Qualtrics XM to create and analyze the survey. I compared the survey responses to the gameplay transcriptions to learn what did and did not work for the game, as well as to answer my research questions. So for the results, it is important to note that the majority of the players had previous interest or experience in both archaeology and playing video games, and very few were older than 34. And with only 9 playthroughs of the game observed, there is not really enough data to make any definitive conclusions about the effect of playing a collaborative video game. However, I did glean some interesting insights that may help in future studies of collaborative play within an archaeological context. So as shown by the survey, all of the participants disagreed after playing the game that archaeologists only care about finding valuable artifacts. The game also strengthened the agreement among players that archaeological theories can and should evolve, and that archaeology is useful. Interestingly, more professionals and degree holders in archaeology and heritage were inclined to disagree that archaeologists' interpretations are correct than the other demographic groups. This seems to indicate that those with more experience in archaeology and heritage became more critical of themselves and their interpretation abilities after playing the game. So everyone had reported enjoying playing the game, and they said that they would play it again. Almost everyone also said that they would be willing to play other archaeological games. Most of the players felt that collaboration with their teammate was crucial for the success of the game. And when I compared these results with the gameplay transcriptions, I found that those who disagreed with that statement participated in gameplays where very little conversation occurred. Discussion during the gameplay varied between every group, and it became apparent that the presence of a second player was not actually enough to instigate collaboration. One player actually noted that they had expected the game to tell them when to collaborate and didn't realize that they were supposed to communicate until towards the end. So a player from that same session actually discussed how it made them reevaluate the cooperative nature of archaeology in general. While it was not my intended message of the game, the player did consider whether scholarship leans too heavily on individual contributions, which is an entirely valid point. The prototype not only gave this player the chance to uncover a fictional site, but also served as a space to play and critically examine the faults and failings in archaeology's efforts to incorporate multivocality. It was also interesting to compare the gameplay transcriptions to my notes at Skipsea Castle and notice some parallels that seem to suggest that the aesthetic of uncertainty was successfully recreated through the prototype. So, to return to the research questions I outlined earlier, it does seem to be the case that player-to-player interaction affects the interpretations made about the site. The survey results show that most players' thinking was influenced by their teammate, and those who disagreed had engaged very little, if at all, in meaningful and reflective discussion during their playthrough. However, there was not enough evidence to prove that there was or was not any significant correlation between the players' relationships and their engagement with each other. The players of the prototype expressed a lot of uncertainty during their sessions, as seen by both their reported and observed emotions. Instilling uncertainty in players was accomplished by excluding information needed to definitively identify artifacts and features within the trench. There were no clear differences between the ways that archaeologists and non-archaeologists conducted their excavations, but even so, that could be boiled down to not enough evidence collected to be able to make any real conclusion about that. This may have also been different if the players were given more information to work from prior to actually beginning excavation on the fictional site, as well as having very few tools to utilize. So they didn't really have any way to make an excavation strategy. So to summarize the results, all of the players were able to achieve success in the game. They all also came to similar, although alternative, conclusions about the fictional site. The opinions and perceptions of archaeology across all backgrounds was more closely aligned after playing the game, except that more archaeologists and heritage professionals and students became more critical of the interpretation abilities of archaeologists than the other groups. Most players additionally expressed confronting the aesthetic of uncertainty. Instigating collaboration was somewhat successful and would have been more effective if the form of collaboration, i.e. communication, was made explicit during instruction. Those who did collaborate, however, found that it affected the way that they interacted with the content. So overall, the game provided players with the opportunity to reflect on life in the Mesolithic as well as on current archaeological practices. Future research may include improving and expanding upon this prototype and or creating frameworks for building other more multiplayer archaeological games. In conclusion, the data gathered from this study suggests that there is a high potential for collaborative archaeological games to challenge and facilitate learning about the nature of archaeological knowledge production. Although the prototype was nowhere near perfect and the number of observed playthroughs was small, the results exhibit a lot of promise for the future of virtual collaboration in archaeology and heritage. So I just want to thank everyone for listening, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this conference and your questions later on.